it started yet.
There we go.
Just a minute.
All right. Well, I'll get used to this sometime for streaming a lesson. So we'll see how this goes. I may record it next time if it doesn't go real well, but we will give it a shot. So I want to welcome everybody here for the lesson. This is part 2 of lesson number 2 in the Psalms, and it was all about the nature of God from the Psalms. The text is very rich, and when I selected these, I thought they were complementing messages. We looked at Psalm 65, 103. Tonight we will look at 113 and 139 to go along with that as well. If you remember correctly, in Psalm 65, we saw how God provides for our needs. He provides for our spiritual needs in the forgiveness that he gives, the freedom from guilt and shame and anxiety and salvation. But he also offers a companionship, a relationship with him. We saw also in that same psalm how he provided for our social needs as well. We saw the poetic language that he used of the mountains and the sea to represent the nations, and how he calms the tumult of the nations. So even in social requirements that we have to be productive children of God, he provides for our social needs too. He provides that stability in life. He provides peace. And we also saw that for us as Christians, he gives us a spiritual identity as part of his kingdom as well. We saw also that he provided for our physical needs, and that was the last part of Psalm 65, where he talked about bringing the rain and the harvest and the herds that painted the meadows. A great picture of just how God provides for all of our needs. In Psalms 103, we looked at what was the motivation. We saw that the motivation that caused God's action was the love and the compassion that he has for all of us. It's proven by the example that he gave in that psalm, which was the example of the children of Israel as they were brought out of Egypt. And it showed how God was patient with them, and how the heights of his love was up to the heavens, was some of the poetic language that was used, and the breadth of his forgiveness was as far as the east and the west. In other words, it was infinity. So we saw the motivation of God in Psalms 103. And we too, in this time, especially this time of tumult and time of the virus that's going around, we too can take comfort in God's looking at 2 lessons from the past and seeing examples of how he was compassionate with his children throughout time, and understanding the depth of his love. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next psalm, Psalm 113. If you'll turn there, we'll read that in a second, and we will see what we can learn about a little bit more about this compassion that God has for us. And hopefully that will give us comfort and hope in this trying time, and help us to get through life with a stronger faith than we started with. Psalms 113, it is not identified who the author is or what the context is, but we know from the historical records that Psalms 113, 114, and 118 formed what was called the Hallel. And this was sung at major festivals like the Passover. It's a song of praise for just who God was. We saw his motivation in the last psalm, and I believe that this psalm will amplify on that previous psalm that we have studied to show the depth of his compassion that he has for us. So I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 9. Bear with me while I read those, and then we will talk about them and see how they apply to us. Psalms 113, verses 1. The psalmist writes, "Praise the Lord, praise, O servants of the Lord, praise the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord from this time forth and forever. From the rising of the sun to the setting, the name of the Lord is to be praised. The Lord is high above all nations, his glory is above the heavens. Who is like the Lord our God, who is enthroned on high. who humbles himself to behold the things that are in heavens and in the earth. He raises the poor from the dust, and he lifts the needy from the ash heaps to make them sit with the princes of his people. He makes the barren woman abide in the house as a joyful mother of children. Praise the Lord. We see in the first 3 verses of Psalms 103 that all of his servants, this is a call for all of his servants to praise God. I don't see any exception in this psalm, and we see that there are no limitations to this praise. If we look at verse 2, it says it's from this time forth and forever, and from the rising of the sun to its setting. So this time and forever, and from the east into the west, everywhere. So every time and everywhere, we should be praising God for who he is. And then we look to verse 4, and we see this contrast and this comparison that we're going to see in this psalm. And unlike in other psalms where the contrast was set up to show the difference between good and evil, this contrast is to show how far God is of nations. He not only rules, but he established all of the governments, and he is above them. Think about the majesty of an earthly king and how lofty that person would be held up in the esteem of people. Now think of the King of heaven and how high and lofty and separated he is from his creation. He is enthroned on high in verse 5, and that comes with the honor and the prestige and the grandeur and the majesty that could only be bestowed upon the creator of all that we see. And now in verse 6, we're going to start seeing this contrast. What did he do? What did this great, awesome God that is above his creation, that is enthroned on high, what did he do with his creation? We see in verse 6, he humbled himself to behold the things that are in the heavens and the earth. I like the way the NIV puts it. It says, who stooped down to look on heaven and earth. I love this imagery of this lofty God that is enthroned on high, and he stoops down. He humbles himself down so that he can see his creation. And who did he humble himself and come down to? Well, he came down not for the pious and not for the rich and the wealthy, but he came down for the poorest of the poor, as we will see as we keep reading on. In verse 7, it says, he raised the poor from the dust and he lifted the needy from the ash heap. Think about when you see pictures of advertisements on television for donations to charitable organizations that work abroad. Where do you normally see the poor sitting? You see them sitting on the ground in the dust. James rebuked his audience in James chapter 2, verse 3, when he was rebuking them for paying favoritism to them. He says, and you pay special attention to those to the one who is wearing fine clothes, and say, you sit in the good place. And to the poor man, you say, you go stand over there, or sit down by my footstool. On the ground, not even given the dignity of a footstool, these people were showing how low they thought of the poor in that situation. And when you think about the poor, think about how low they are below and dependent upon everybody else. And also in this verse here, you see that the poor, these lowest of low, are only surpassed by those who are lifted, the needy from the ash heaps. And think about the imagery of that. What happened? Where were the ash heaps found? They were found outside the camp. They were found where things were discarded. It was outside the camp where the hides and the discards of the sacrifices were burned. It was a place of great stench. It was dirty. But this is where the outcast would go. He has grace, and because of his compassion. And what does he do? He lifts them up and he gives them status. In verse 8, he says he makes them sit with the princes of his people. He doesn't just give them status among worldly people. He said he makes them princes among his people, his chosen people. So these are people of real status as far as God is concerned. God is unchanging through time. I think it may be good to describe what this looks like to us as Christians. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 13. Keep your thumb there in the Psalms, but turn over, please, to Hebrews chapter 13. And I think this will describe how we are lifted up. We're going to start reading in verse 11. And in verse 11, he says, "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burnt outside the camp." That's where the ash heaps are. "Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his blood, suffered outside the gates. So let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." You see, Jesus meets us there, and he lifts us up from there, or we are to meet him there and share in his reproach. And what does he give us? He lifts us up and he makes us heirs of a kingdom. He makes us princes, sons of God. And how are we supposed to feel when this lofty and majestic God lifts us up and puts us on a higher plane? In verse 9, we see that joy described as he makes the barren women abide in the house. We're back in Psalms 103. As a joyful mother of children. Think about the barren women that are described in scriptures. I'm sure you can think of a few. I'm sure Sarah comes to mind, where in her old age, when she was beyond childbearing age, she gave birth to a son. And in that, she was joyful, and she said even those around because of his name would laugh with her out of that joy. You might think of Elizabeth in the New Testament. Before she gave, when she gave birth to John, she also was barren. And it says in Luke 1:58, her neighbors and her relatives heard that the Lord had displayed his great mercy toward her, and they were rejoicing with her. She was barren, but then she had a son, and what great rejoicing. Samuel chapter 1, verse 15, it says, when Hannah was rebuked by the priest thinking that she was drunk, she says, "No, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord." That's how distressed she was. But that's contrasted with the joy that she describes in the second chapter. And I'll just read the first couple of verses of 1 Samuel chapter 2. "And Hannah prayed and said, my heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God." 1 Samuel 2, verses 1 and 2. Hannah took refuge in the promise that was given to her that she would have a son, and God did not disappoint. And her joy was described as being her heart exalted, and she was exalted, and she indeed rejoiced because of that. And when we are lifted up, that's the type of joy that we should have as well. So I think you can see in this psalm how far-reaching he is willing to stoop and raise us up out of the ash heaps and out of the dirt. And of course, Christ is the ultimate expression of just how far he is willing to go to help the needy, the lost, and the forgotten. And we can all praise God for that. We often sing a song, "Love Lifted Me." Next time you sing that song, think of 103 and how God showed his compassion to his children by lifting them up out of the dirt and out of the ashes. What a wonderful psalm. So we saw the depth of his compassion. And the last psalm that we're going to look at is Psalms 139. And Psalms 139 talks to the intimacy of God. We know from our Bibles that David is the author. We do not know what the context is. And many people regard this psalm as the grandeur of God's omniscience and the omnipresence of God and the greatness of his reach and the depth of his knowledge. And while that is all true and it is all wonderful, I think it also speaks to this intimacy that our God has with his creation. That's you and me. The relationship God has with man. It starts with David being known by God and then wanting to be known by God. So let's go ahead and read the first 10 verses of Psalms 139, and then we'll get into and kind of break it down a little bit. Psalms 139, and we'll start in verse 1. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thoughts from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down. You are intimately acquainted with all of my ways. Even before there was a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you knew it all. You have enclosed me behind and before. You laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain it. Where can I go? You see in verse 1, he starts out and he says, you have searched me and known me. And that word searched, if you look in Strong's, one of the definitions is to examine intimately. So David was examined intimately by the Lord. And then in the next couple of verses, you see some examples of this examination. You see some examples of just how intimately God knew David. Things as mundane as when he sat down and when he stood up in verse 2, even God understood that. In verse 2, you also see that he understood my thoughts from afar. That could be either from heaven, he understands my thoughts while he is in heaven, or it could be that even before the thoughts were an inception of mine, he understood what the outcome was going to be. So all those years ago when I considered an idea and I acted upon it, he knew what the outcome today was going to be. Either way, he knew it he understands my thoughts from afar. And what a wonderful thing that is. He understands when I lie down or when I'm on the path in verse 3. And when God knows what our ways are, he understands what our intent is, what our desires are. He understands the apprehensions that we might have in the way that we have chosen. And he also understands our motivation. And when we have chosen the way that we are going to travel, that's an intimate knowledge that God has about our intentions and our walk. In verse 4, he can also understand our thoughts before they are even formed into words. He says, even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, thou dost know it all. And in verse 5, he encloses me behind and before, and that could mean he knows my past and my future, or it could be where he's been hedged about. Either way, it's an intimate position where God is knowing David before and afterwards. And then he goes on to say, he has laid his hand upon me. And that generally implies, the way that I understand it, this leading or guiding. And you will see that this is a reoccurring theme throughout this psalm, is this leading, this laying his hand upon him, leading him. And at the end, David is asking for him to lead him by the hand. And when David thinks about all of this intimate knowledge that God has of him, in verse 6, he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain it. He knows David's past, his future, his thoughts, his path. That's intimacy. Look back at those verses and look at all the personal pronouns that David used, all the I's and all the my path and all the me's that he used. That is an intimacy that God has with us. And that's what he has with us, with this omniscience that God has about, he's all knowing, but he's also all knowing about me. And in verse 7, he switches gears here and stops talking about the omniscience and starts talking about the characteristics of his omnipresence and how that is a benefit to us as well. The Spirit of God is not limited. And I love the poetic language that's used in verses 8 and 9. Look at the language here. If I ascend to heaven or if I make my bed in Sheol, think about the poetic nature of that, up or down. And when you combine that with verse 9, where he talks about the wings of the dawn, which would be to the east, or hidden in the sea, which is to the west, poetically, he could be saying, whether I go north or south or east or west, wherever I go, God's Spirit is there with me. And in verse 10, he says, even there thy hand will lead me, and thy right hand will lay hold of me. Again, that take our lights. And when that intimacy of God's knowledge about him, let's go ahead and read verse 15 and 16. He says, my frame was not hidden from thee, and when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth, thine eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in thy book they were all written. The days were ordained for me, yet as yet there was not one of them. That's a personal knowledge that God has of it was before he was even formed in his mother's womb. God was not hindered by that differential of time. He knew David before his conception. And he also, in these verses, it says that his days were ordained. Another way to put that is there was a purpose for David's life. God's hand was guiding David by the way he formed him. David still had to make choices, and we still have to choose whether to follow the purpose that God has made for our life. But God created us with purpose, and God created David with purpose. And this thought was too much for David. Let's turn to 17. Let's read 17 and 18 and continue this thought. How precious also are thy thoughts, of me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sands. And when I awake, I am still with thee. This is too much for David to comprehend. The creator of the universe has this personal knowledge of him, of his form, of his purpose, and that was, the thoughts could not be counted. It was like the sands of the sea. And what a wonderful thing to have a God that wants to have that kind of an intimate knowledge of us, as he did with David. In verse 19, this starts a contrast that will set the stage for the last part, for the conclusion of this. And as we had talked about in previous classes, when you start seeing these contrasts, especially when there's a contrast of how wicked a people are or how bad they are or what their fate is, that contrast is usually to show what the opposite is. And the greater the contrast, the more the intense the message is supposed to be at the other end. Let's go ahead and read 19 through 22. Oh, that thou wouldest slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed, for they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred they have become. You see here, David is describing what the wicked are like. How awful are the wicked. They're deserving of destruction because they are men of bloodshed and their wickedness, and they're enemies of God. And enemies of God are deserving of the wrath of God. And then in the verse where he talks about hating them, you could look at this as an acknowledgement that David is not making an allegiance with them. He is on the opposite side of them. He hates them to show that he's acknowledging his allegiance to God, because he's on the side of God that is hated by these men, and therefore that is the feeling that he has as well. And then it leads to the conclusion in verse 23 and 24, where David, again, if you remember in the first verse, he said, thou hast searched me And in this verse, he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there is any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. And in contrast to what he was making a minute ago about the wicked, he's like, I don't want to be like that. So he begs God, search me and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there is any hurtful way in me. You see, this is a plea to remain in that relationship with God, that intimate relationship with God that we saw in the earlier parts. And he's asking for this guidance. Look again, there are 4 different times where this guidance is given throughout this this psalm. So over these 4 psalms that we've looked at, and there's such a massive amount of knowledge about God in all of the Psalms. If you look at just these 4 Psalms, we see how God has provided for us. He's shown love and compassion. He lifts up the lowly, and he knows us intimately as individuals. And we can take this knowledge, and it will help us in our life. It will help give us hope and give us faith. But next week, when we start our lesson next week, we are going to look at how understanding of this knowledge about God, what is going to be our response to this understanding of who